The flight to freedom. The airport was bustling as Marcus and Aisha Johnson walked hand in hand through the expansive terminal. For them, this wasn't just another flight. It was an escape. Months of grueling work and sleepless nights had culminated in this brief weekend getaway, a celebration of their shared triumphs. Marcus had recently closed a major deal for his burgeoning tech company, while Aisha had successfully defended a case that had garnered national attention. Yet, as they moved through the crowded terminal, their excitement was laced with a quiet vigilance, a sense honed over years of living with unspoken judgments and subtle biases. Marcus adjusted his tailored blazer, a small habitual gesture that spoke of his need for composure. Aisha, ever the picture of grace, carried herself with the poise of a woman who had fought hard for her place in the world. She wore a flowing cobalt dress that accentuated her elegance, her natural curls framing her face like a crown. To any onlooker, they were the epitome of success, a couple deeply in love, radiating confidence. But beneath the polished exterior lay the reality they rarely spoke about, even to each other. "I double-checked our gate," Marcus said, his deep voice steady as they approached the check-in counter for their first-class flight. "Everything's set." Aisha nodded, her lips curving into a soft smile. "Good. I'm ready to leave work behind for a while. Just us, the ocean, and no emails." They presented their IDs and boarding passes, their interaction with the airline agent polite and routine. The agent smiled warmly as she handed their documents back. "Enjoy your flight." Moments like these, a simple exchange devoid of suspicion, were rare enough to feel notable. Aisha glanced at Marcus, sharing a brief look of relief. They navigated the security line and walked toward the luxury lounge for first-class passengers, where a quiet calm replaced the chaos of the terminal. As they sipped sparkling water and waited for their boarding call, Marcus leaned back in his chair. "This is going to be good for us," he said, his voice softening. "We need this." Aisha reached across the table, resting her hand over his. "I know. I feel like I can finally breathe." When the boarding announcement came, they were among the first to step onto the sleek aircraft. The warm lighting of the first-class cabin greeted them like an invitation to unwind. Marcus placed their carry-ons in the overhead compartment before settling into his seat. Aisha adjusted the silk scarf around her neck and glanced out the window. The view of the tarmac wasn't particularly inspiring, but the promise of what lay beyond was enough. As the plane began to fill, a flight attendant named Monica made her way down the aisle. Her uniform was impeccably pressed, and her blonde hair was styled into a tight bun that seemed to match the rigidity of her demeanor. She was chatting with a passenger in a navy suit, her laughter carrying over the soft hum of the engines. But her eyes darted briefly toward Marcus and Aisha, a flicker of something unreadable crossing her face. Aisha noticed first. She had an innate sense for these things, a radar for subtle shifts in behavior that Marcus sometimes envied. She didn't say anything, but Marcus felt the change in her posture. Her back straightened slightly, her hand smoothing over the hem of her dress. "You see her?" Marcus asked quietly, his voice low enough not to draw attention. Aisha nodded, her tone measured. "She's watching us." "Probably nothing," Marcus replied, though he couldn't quite convince himself. Monica's presence loomed closer as she began her routine checks. When she stopped at their row, her smile was polite but didn't quite reach her eyes. "Good afternoon. May I see your tickets again, please?" Marcus exchanged a glance with Aisha before retrieving the neatly folded boarding passes from his jacket pocket. He handed them over without hesitation. "Of course." Aisha followed suit, passing her boarding pass with a calm composure that masked the tension building beneath the surface. Monica studied the tickets longer than necessary, flipping them as if expecting to find something amiss. After an extended pause, she handed them back with a curt nod. "Thank you," she said, but there was no warmth in her tone. "I'll be back shortly." She moved on, leaving behind a residue of discomfort that clung to the air. Aisha adjusted her scarf, her fingers steady despite the unease rippling through her. She didn't ask anyone else for their tickets. No, Marcus agreed, his jaw tightening. She didn't. The cabin's atmosphere remained outwardly calm, but Marcus could feel the shift. The hum of the engine seemed louder, almost oppressive. Passengers continued their conversations, the clinking of glasses and the rustling of newspapers filling the silence. Yet Marcus was acutely aware of the older man across the aisle, who had been sneaking glances at them since they boarded. His silver hair gleamed under the cabin lights, and his skeptical gaze lingered just long enough to be noticeable. Years of navigating similar situations had taught Marcus and Aisha to read the room, to recognize when they were being tested in ways others might not be. These moments, wrapped in a veneer of politeness, were never as benign as they seemed. "Let it go," Marcus murmured, though his voice lacked conviction. Aisha's lips pressed into a thin line. "You and I both know it's never that simple." When Monica returned, her demeanor had shifted. The veneer of politeness was gone, replaced by something colder. "I'm going to need you both to come with me," she said, her voice clipped. "There seems to be an issue with your seating." Aisha's eyes narrowed, but her expression remained poised. "Our tickets are for these seats. There shouldn't be any issue." Monica's stance hardened. "We can sort it out in the galley," she said, gesturing toward the back of the plane. The murmurs around them grew louder, passengers craning their necks to watch the exchange. Marcus felt the weight of their stares as he stood, collecting his carry-on with deliberate calm. Aisha followed, her chin slightly raised as she walked behind Monica. Each step down the aisle felt heavier, the scrutiny of the cabin pressing down on them like an invisible force. By the time they reached the galley, the air seemed to crackle with unspoken tension. Monica turned to face them, arms crossed over her chest. "There's been a mistake," she said flatly. "These seats aren't yours." Aisha tilted her head, her voice sharp with quiet authority. "Our tickets were scanned and confirmed at the gate. There's no mistake." Monica's eyes narrowed further. "If you don't cooperate, I'll have to involve security." Marcus inhaled deeply, his gaze steady. "Before you do that," he said, his voice calm but firm, "you might want to consider the consequences." For the first time, doubt flickered across Monica's face. But the moment was fleeting. She squared her shoulders and reached for the phone in the galley. Marcus and Aisha exchanged a glance. The storm was building, and Monica was at its center, unaware that she had misjudged the power of the winds around her. The ripple effect begins. The galley was tight, its metallic walls closing in like a cage. Marcus and Aisha stood with practiced stillness, their expressions calm but their resolve unshaken. Monica's rigid posture spoke volumes, her back stiff, her fingers gripping the edge of a small counter as if it were the last anchor to her unraveling authority. The air in the galley crackled with unspoken tension. Aisha adjusted the strap of her bag and raised an eyebrow, her voice smooth and steady. "Calling security won't change the facts, Monica. We belong in those seats." Monica didn't meet her gaze. Instead, she spoke into the intercom with clipped precision. "Captain, we have a seating discrepancy in the first-class cabin. I need assistance." The message sent, Monica turned to them, her arms crossed. "You'll need to wait here until this is resolved." Marcus leaned casually against the counter, his eyes sharp. "Resolved," he repeated, his voice low and measured. "Or escalated." Monica's lips thinned, her confidence wavering under his steady gaze. Aisha, standing just beside him, tilted her head. "You've already decided we don't belong, haven't you? No amount of evidence would change your mind." For a split second, Marcus thought Monica might snap back, but instead she faltered. Her silence spoke louder than any retort. It was the kind of silence Marcus and Aisha knew all too well, the hesitation of someone realizing they might be in the wrong, yet too proud to admit it. Just as the weight of the moment began to settle, the curtain leading to the first-class cabin rustled. Clara, another flight attendant, stepped through. Her demeanor was calm but curious, her kind eyes flicking between Monica, Marcus, and Aisha. "What's going on here?" Clara asked, her voice soft but firm. Monica straightened, eager for backup. There's a seating issue. I've already called for the captain. Clara's gaze lingered on Monica for a moment longer than necessary before shifting to Marcus and Aisha. I'm sorry, she said gently, but can I see your tickets again? Marcus handed them over without hesitation, his expression neutral. Aisha crossed her arms, her posture a quiet testament to her inner strength. Clara took her time examining the tickets, flipping them over as Monica had done earlier. But unlike Monica, her expression shifted quickly to one of quiet realization. These are valid, Clara said, her voice carrying a note of finality. She turned to Monica, her brow furrowing. There's no issue with their seats. Monica stiffened. Well, I wasn't sure. It's protocol to verify. Clara's lips pressed into a thin line, but she didn't argue. Instead, she handed the tickets back to Marcus and Aisha, offering an apologetic smile. I'm so sorry for the confusion. Aisha returned the smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. Thank you for your professionalism, she said pointedly, her gaze shifting briefly to Monica. Before anything more could be said, the captain arrived. Captain Harris was a tall, broad-shouldered man with an air of quiet authority. He stepped into the galley, his sharp eyes quickly assessing the situation. Monica, he said, his tone firm but calm. What's the issue here? Monica hesitated, her confidence unraveling under the captain's steady gaze. I thought there was a discrepancy with their tickets, she said, her voice quieter now. Captain Harris turned to Marcus and Aisha. May I see your tickets? Marcus handed them over once more, this time with a small, knowing smile. Captain Harris examined them briefly before nodding. These are in order, he said, his voice loud enough for everyone in the galley to hear. You're both seated correctly. He handed the tickets back and turned to Monica, his expression hardening. There was no need to escalate this. Monica opened her mouth to respond, but the captain held up a hand. Return to your duties, he said curtly. I'll handle this. The dismissal was clear. Monica's face reddened, but she nodded stiffly and left the galley without another word. Clara lingered for a moment, her gaze following Monica before she turned back to Marcus and Aisha. I'm really sorry, she said softly. That shouldn't have happened. Aisha smiled faintly. We appreciate you stepping in. Marcus nodded, his voice steady. Thank you, Clara. It means more than you know. Clara returned the nod and disappeared back into the cabin. Captain Harris, now alone with Marcus and Aisha, let out a small sigh. I want to personally apologize for this incident, he said. It's unacceptable, and I'll be filing a report. We appreciate that, Captain, Marcus said. But this isn't just about us. This is bigger than one flight. Captain Harris met his gaze, understanding flickering in his eyes. I know, he said quietly. I'll do what I can to make sure it doesn't happen again. With that, he escorted them back to their seats. The cabin was eerily quiet as they returned, every passenger's eyes following their movements. Marcus and Aisha sat down, their composure unbroken, though the weight of the ordeal lingered in the air. Across the aisle, the older man with silver hair leaned forward slightly. Handled yourself well, he murmured, his voice low enough that only Marcus and Aisha could hear. Marcus nodded. Thank you. The man hesitated, then added, she was out of line. Everyone saw it. Aisha glanced at him, her voice calm but firm. Did they? The man opened his mouth to respond but thought better of it. He nodded once more and leaned back in his seat, his expression thoughtful. As the plane began its descent, Marcus and Aisha sat in silence. They had won this battle, but the victory felt hollow. The echoes of what had happened would linger, not just for them, but for everyone who had witnessed it. The storm beyond the clouds. The descent of the plane was marked by a heavy stillness, one that seemed to extend beyond the hum of the engines and the rhythmic chatter of the intercom. The tension that had brewed during the flight remained, swirling invisibly around Marcus and Aisha as the cabin prepared for landing. Marcus stared out the window, watching the cityscape grow larger, while Aisha closed her eyes briefly, grounding herself with slow, deliberate breaths. The older man across the aisle shifted in his seat, stealing glances at them. His earlier comments still hung in the air, a fleeting acknowledgement of what they had endured. Marcus, however, had no interest in lingering on the passengers' half-hearted sympathies. This wasn't about their validation. It was about what came next. When the plane finally touched down, the collective relief of the passengers was palpable. Seat belts clicked open, luggage bins were unlatched, and the rustling of jackets and carry-ons filled the cabin. But for Marcus and Aisha, the end of the flight didn't bring closure. It simply marked the beginning of the fallout. As they waited for the aisle to clear, Monica appeared near the galley, her posture stiff and her expression guarded. For a fleeting moment, her gaze met Aisha's. The moment stretched, heavy with unspoken words, before Monica quickly looked away and busied herself with arranging cups on a tray. Aisha said nothing, but her slight tilt of the head and raised brows spoke volumes. "I think she knows," Marcus murmured under his breath. "She knows she was wrong," Aisha replied evenly. "But that doesn't mean she'll admit it." Finally, it was their turn to disembark. Marcus retrieved their carry-ons while Aisha adjusted her scarf, her movements deliberate and calm. As they stepped into the aisle, passengers turned their heads, some offering polite nods, others avoiding eye contact entirely. The silver-haired man gave them a subtle thumbs-up, but Marcus didn't acknowledge it. He wasn't in the mood for gestures that cost nothing. At the door of the plane, Captain Harris stood waiting. His broad shoulders blocked the narrow exit as he extended a hand to Marcus. "Mr. and Mrs. Johnson," he said, his tone professional but sincere. "I'd like to apologize again for what happened on board. Rest assured, this will be addressed." Marcus shook his hand, his grip firm. "We appreciate that, Captain." Aisha simply nodded, her silence saying more than words could. They stepped past him and into the jet bridge, their footsteps echoing against the metallic walls. As they neared the terminal, Marcus noticed two uniformed security officers standing near the gate. Their presence was subtle but deliberate, their eyes scanning the crowd. Monica appeared a moment later, her steps hesitant as she approached the officers. The stiffness in her shoulders betrayed her discomfort. Marcus stopped walking for a moment, his gaze fixed on the scene unfolding. Aisha turned to him, her expression unreadable. "Let her deal with it," she said softly. "It's not our fight anymore." He nodded, but the tightness in his chest remained. He wasn't sure if it was satisfaction or frustration, or perhaps both, that stirred within him as Monica was pulled aside by the officers. Either way, he didn't linger. They had a flight to move past, a life to return to. As they approached baggage claim, the air seemed lighter, but only marginally. Aisha scanned the carousel for their luggage, while Marcus leaned against a nearby pillar, his thoughts far from the airport. His phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him back to the moment. He glanced at the screen. An unknown number. He hesitated before answering. "This is Marcus." A polite yet detached voice greeted him. "Mr. Carter, this is Rachel from the airline's executive team. I'd like to discuss the incident that occurred on your flight. Do you have a moment?" Marcus glanced at Aisha, who was lifting her suitcase from the carousel with practiced ease. He exhaled slowly. "Go ahead." Rachel's tone was professional, but Marcus could hear the undercurrent of damage control. "First, let me apologize on behalf of the airline. What happened to you and your wife is unacceptable, and we are committed to addressing it." "Are you?" Marcus replied, his voice calm but sharp. "Or are you just committed to ensuring this doesn't make headlines?" There was a pause on the other end, and Marcus could almost hear Rachel recalibrating. "I assure you, Mr. Carter, we take these matters very seriously. We believe there may have been a misunderstanding." "There it is," Marcus interrupted, his tone cutting. "The word you've been waiting to use. A misunderstanding." "Mr. Carter." "No," Marcus said firmly. "You don't get to frame it that way. This wasn't a misunderstanding. Monica knew exactly what she was doing. She saw us, made assumptions, and acted on them. Call it what it is." The silence that followed was heavy. When Rachel finally spoke, her voice was quieter, almost hesitant. "I hear you, Mr. Carter, and I promise this will be investigated thoroughly." Marcus didn't respond immediately. He wasn't interested in promises that carried no weight. Instead, he simply said, "I'll be waiting to see how you handle it." He ended the call and slipped his phone back into his pocket. Aisha approached, her suitcase rolling behind her. "Was that about the flight?" she asked, her tone casual but curious. Marcus nodded. "Corporate. Promised to investigate." Aisha raised an eyebrow. "Think they'll actually do anything?" Marcus shrugged. "Not unless it becomes inconvenient for them not to." Aisha didn't reply, but the slight curve of her lips suggested she agreed. As they stepped outside into the brisk evening air, a sense of quiet determination settled over them. The city buzzed around them, indifferent to the storm they had just weathered. But Marcus and Aisha knew this wasn't the end. Moments like these didn't simply fade. They rippled outward, touching lives in ways that were often unseen. "Do you think Monica will think about this?" Marcus asked as they waited for their cab. Aisha adjusted her scarf, her gaze steady. "She'll think about how it affected her, not about us. And the passengers. They'll forget," Aisha said simply. "But we won't." Marcus nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "No, we won't." As the cab pulled up and they climbed inside, Marcus leaned back against the seat, his hand resting lightly on Aisha's. The weight of the day remained, but it was no longer theirs alone to carry. They had spoken their truth, and now it was up to others to decide what to do with it. For Marcus and Aisha, the journey wasn't just about reaching a destination. It was about leaving a trail behind, a reminder to the world that they wouldn't be silent. Not now, not ever. Confronting the aftermath. The glow of the city faded as the cab sped toward Marcus and Aisha's apartment. They sat in silence, the rhythmic hum of tires against pavement filling the space between them. Marcus stared out the window, watching the world rush by in fleeting flashes of neon signs and streetlights. He could feel the tension still simmering, an invisible thread connecting them to what had happened on the plane. Aisha rested her head lightly against the window, her fingers tracing slow circles on the handle of her bag. Her quiet resolve, a trait Marcus had always admired, seemed unshaken. Yet he knew her well enough to recognize the subtle shift in her energy, the heaviness she carried, even when she didn't speak of it. When they arrived at their apartment, Marcus tipped the driver and carried their bags inside. The warmth of the lobby felt almost stifling after the crisp night air. As they stepped into the elevator, Marcus glanced at Aisha, who was staring at the floor numbers lighting up above them. "Do you think we should push harder with the airline?" he asked, breaking the silence. Aisha turned to him, her expression thoughtful. "We already know how this plays out. They'll issue a statement, promise retraining, and hope it all goes away." Marcus frowned, leaning against the elevator wall. "And Monica?" "She'll be shuffled onto another flight, maybe given a warning," Aisha replied. "But people like her rarely face real consequences." The elevator dinged, and they stepped out into the hallway. The weight of the day seemed to follow them as they entered their apartment. Marcus set the bags down by the door and hung up his coat, his movements deliberate. Aisha moved into the living room, pausing by the window to gaze out at the glittering city below. "She probably thinks we're the problem," Marcus said, joining her by the window. "That we made a scene, overreacted." Aisha sighed, her breath fogging the glass. "Of course she does. It's easier than admitting she was wrong." Marcus's jaw tightened as he looked out at the city. "I just can't shake the feeling that this won't stop with us. What happens when she does this to someone who doesn't know how to handle it?" Aisha turned to him, her expression firm. "Then we make sure she's held accountable. We can't stop what's already happened, but we can make sure the next person doesn't have to go through it." Marcus nodded slowly, her words grounding him. He reached for his phone, scrolling through his contacts until he found the number for Rachel, the airline representative who had called earlier. Without hesitating, he pressed the call button. The phone rang twice before Rachel answered, her tone bright but cautious. "Mr. Carter, I wasn't expecting to hear from you so soon." Marcus wasted no time. "I've been thinking about our conversation, and I want to know exactly what the airline plans to do about Monica." There was a pause on the other end before Rachel replied, her voice measured. "As I mentioned earlier, we're conducting a thorough investigation. Monica's actions will be reviewed by our disciplinary committee." "And what does that mean exactly?" Marcus pressed. "Will she face real consequences, or is this just a formality?" Rachel hesitated, and Marcus could almost hear the gears turning as she crafted her response. "Our goal is to ensure that all our employees adhere to the highest standards of professionalism and respect. If Monica's behavior is found to have violated our policies, appropriate action will be taken." Marcus's voice hardened. "Appropriate action? That's vague, Rachel. This wasn't a minor lapse in judgment. It was blatant discrimination." "I understand your frustration, Mr. Carter," Rachel said, her tone shifting to one of carefully practiced empathy. "And I assure you, we take this very seriously. However, I can't discuss the specifics of personnel matters." Marcus exhaled sharply, his grip tightening on the phone. "Let me be clear," he said, his voice low but firm. "If your airline doesn't address this properly, I will. I've already documented everything that happened, and I'm prepared to take this public if necessary." There was a long silence on the other end before Rachel replied, her voice quieter now. "We'll be in touch with an update soon, Mr. Carter. Thank you for bringing this to our attention." Marcus ended the call and set his phone down on the counter. Aisha watched him from the couch, her expression unreadable. "Do you think they'll actually do something?" she asked. "I don't know," Marcus admitted, rubbing the back of his neck. "But I'm not going to let them sweep this under the rug." Aisha leaned back, her gaze thoughtful. "We've always known the fight isn't fair," she said softly. "But that doesn't mean we stop fighting." Her words lingered in the air, a quiet reminder of the resilience they had cultivated over years of navigating a world that often questioned their worth. The ripple reaches further. The following morning, Marcus woke to the soft buzz of his phone on the nightstand. He groaned, reaching for it with one hand while rubbing his eyes with the other. A notification lit up the screen. An email from Rachel with the subject line, "Follow-up on flight incident." Marcus opened the email, scanning the carefully worded message. It was everything he had expected. Apologies, assurances of an ongoing investigation, and a promise to follow up once the review was complete. He set the phone down, a bitter smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "What is it?" Aisha asked, appearing in the doorway with a steaming cup of tea. "Damage control," Marcus replied, holding up the phone. "They're still investigating." Aisha handed him the tea and sat beside him on the bed. "What do you want to do?" Marcus took a sip, letting the warmth of the tea settle his nerves. "I'm not letting this go. I'll give them a chance to do the right thing, but if they don't, I'll make sure people hear about it." Aisha nodded, her hand resting lightly on his arm. "We'll handle this together." As they sat there, the morning light streaming through the curtains, Marcus felt a renewed sense of purpose. The events on the plane were more than an isolated incident. They were a reflection of a larger issue, one that couldn't be ignored. The fight wasn't over, but Marcus and Aisha were ready. Together, they would ensure their voices were heard, not just for themselves, but for everyone who had ever been made to feel like they didn't belong. A call to action. The sun cast long golden beams through the city skyline as Marcus sat at the dining table, laptop open, his fingers flying over the keyboard. Beside him, Aisha scrolled through her phone, her expression shifting between concentration and quiet determination. They had spent the morning piecing together a timeline of the incident on the flight, not for themselves, but for something larger. A statement of truth they intended to make public if the airline failed to act. The email from Rachel had been as expected, vague and carefully curated to minimize liability. it wasn't enough. The weight of that realization pushed Marcus and Aisha into action. "I think we should include details about what happened after we landed," Marcus said, glancing at Aisha. "The security officers waiting for Monica, the way passengers avoided eye contact. It all adds to the story." Aisha nodded, her fingers pausing mid-scroll. "Agreed. It paints the full picture. But we need to focus on more than just the incident. This isn't about one flight. It's about a pattern. If we're going public, we need to make this resonate." Marcus leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. "You're right. It's bigger than us. We're not just calling out Monica. We're calling out a system that allows this behavior to go unchecked." Aisha's gaze softened as she reached across the table, resting her hand on his. "We're doing the right thing," she said quietly, "even if it's exhausting." Marcus gave her a small, grateful smile. "It's worth it." The story gains momentum. By afternoon, the framework of their statement was complete. It was concise yet powerful, weaving together their personal experience with broader statistics about discrimination in travel. Aisha had reached out to a friend in media relations who agreed to help shape the narrative into something even more impactful. Together, they crafted a clear message. Incidents like theirs weren't isolated. They were symptomatic of a deeper problem. As Marcus hit send on the final draft to their contact, his phone buzzed with an incoming call. It was a local journalist who had caught wind of the story through a mutual friend. "Mr. Carter," the journalist began, her voice brisk but warm, "I heard about what happened on your flight. Would you be willing to speak on the record?" Marcus hesitated, glancing at Aisha, who nodded encouragingly. "Yes," he said, his voice steady. "We're ready to talk." The conversation lasted nearly an hour, during which Marcus recounted the events with precision and clarity. He emphasized not just what had happened, but why it mattered, framing the narrative as part of a broader need for accountability in the airline industry. The journalist listened intently, asking thoughtful questions and taking detailed notes. By the end of the call, Marcus felt a sense of relief. Their voices were being amplified, and the story was beginning to take shape. The airline responds. The next morning, as Marcus and Aisha sipped their coffee, Marcus's phone buzzed with a notification, an email from Rachel. The subject line read, "Update on investigation." Marcus opened it, his eyes scanning the text quickly. "You're not going to believe this," he said, passing the phone to Aisha. The email outlined the airline's findings. Monica had violated company policy by unnecessarily escalating the situation. As a result, she would be placed on administrative leave pending further review. The email also included a vague promise of company-wide training initiatives to address unconscious bias. "Training initiatives," Aisha said, rolling her eyes. "That's their big solution." Marcus frowned. "It's something, but it's not enough. They're trying to placate us without addressing the root issue." Aisha set the phone down and crossed her arms. "We need to keep the pressure on. If they think this is over, nothing will change." Marcus nodded. "Agreed. Let's see how the public reacts once the article goes live." The article drops. That afternoon, the story hit the local news website, complete with a headline that couldn't be ignored. "First-class passengers face discrimination on airline. A call for accountability." The article detailed Marcus and Aisha's experience, weaving in broader commentary about systemic issues in the airline industry. It included quotes from Marcus, who spoke passionately about the need for change, and from Aisha, whose calm yet piercing words underscored the gravity of the situation. Within hours, the story began to gain traction. Comments flooded the site, many from people sharing similar experiences. On social media, the hashtag #FlyingWhileBlack started trending, with users calling out the airline and demanding meaningful action. Marcus and Aisha watched as their story spread, the ripple effect reaching further than they had anticipated. It wasn't just about them anymore. It was about everyone who had ever been made to feel like they didn't belong. The pressure builds. By evening, the airline issued a public statement. It was polished, yet it fell short of addressing the heart of the issue. "We regret the experience Mr. and Mrs. Johnson endured and are committed to ensuring all passengers feel welcome," it read. The statement promised improved training programs and an internal review process. Aisha scoffed as she read it aloud. Improved training. That's their big takeaway. Marcus sighed, setting down his laptop. They're trying to weather the storm without making real changes. Their frustration was palpable, but so was their determination. The public response to their story had sparked something, a collective demand for accountability. Marcus and Aisha knew they had to keep pushing, not just for themselves, but for everyone who had ever been wronged by the system. The unexpected call. Late that night, as they sat together on the couch, Marcus's phone buzzed again. This time, the caller ID displayed an unfamiliar number. He hesitated before answering. "This is Marcus," he said. "Mr. Carter, this is Jonathan Harris, the captain from your flight," the voice on the other end said. "I wanted to reach out personally." Marcus sat up straighter, exchanging a glance with Aisha. "Captain Harris, I wasn't expecting this." "I've been following the news," Harris continued, his tone measured. "And I wanted to say, I'm sorry, not just for what happened, but for not stepping in sooner. I should have done more." Marcus was silent for a moment, processing the unexpected apology. "You did more than most," he finally said. "But this is bigger than you or me." Harris sighed. "I know. That's why I'm calling. If you're open to it, I'd like to work with you to push for real changes. I can't fix the past, but I can help make sure this doesn't happen again." Aisha leaned closer, her eyes meeting Marcus's. He could see the question in her gaze, the flicker of hope. "We'd be open to that," Marcus said, his voice steady. "But it has to be more than lip service." "Agreed," Harris said. "Let's set up a meeting. I'll bring what influence I have, and together, we'll make some noise." When the call ended, Marcus leaned back, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Maybe this isn't over after all. Aisha returned his smile, the fire in her eyes undimmed. "It's just getting started. A movement takes flight." The days following the captain's call were a whirlwind. Marcus and Aisha found themselves at the center of a conversation they hadn't entirely anticipated, but were ready to lead. Their story, now amplified by local and national media, had struck a chord. News outlets picked up the article, and social media continued to buzz with demands for change. Emails flooded their inbox, messages of support from strangers, stories from others who had faced similar discrimination, and even inquiries from activists and legal organizations offering their assistance. Marcus and Aisha sifted through them carefully, responding to as many as they could. One email, however, stood out. It came from a prominent civil rights lawyer, Donna Caldwell, whose firm had a reputation for taking on high-profile cases involving systemic injustice. The subject line was simple: "Let's make this count." A bigger platform. The meeting with Donna was set for the following week. Marcus and Aisha arrived at her sleek downtown office, where sunlight streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the bustling city below. Donna greeted them with a warm smile and a firm handshake. She was a tall, commanding woman whose presence filled the room. "Marcus, Aisha," she said, motioning for them to sit. "I've been following your story closely. What happened to you is unacceptable, and I think this is an opportunity to do more than just hold the airline accountable." Marcus exchanged a glance with Aisha before speaking. "What do you have in mind?" Donna leaned forward, her eyes sharp with purpose. "This isn't just about one flight attendant or one airline. It's about an industry that has consistently failed to address bias at every level. I want to work with you to push for systemic reform, starting with legislation that mandates comprehensive bias training and transparent accountability measures across all airlines." Aisha's brows lifted slightly. "Legislation. That's ambitious." "It is," Donna admitted. "But your story has sparked a national conversation. People are listening, and that gives us leverage. With the right strategy, We can turn this into lasting change." Marcus nodded slowly, the weight of her words settling over him. "We're in," he said. "Whatever it takes." The town hall. Their first step was organizing a town hall event to amplify voices and gather support. Held in a historic community center, the event was packed with attendees from all walks of life. Activists, community leaders, and everyday citizens filled the room, their energy palpable. Marcus stood at the podium, his voice steady but impassioned. "What happened to us on that flight wasn't an isolated incident," he began. "It's part of a pattern, one that too many people in this room know all too well. But together, we can change that." The audience erupted in applause, their cheers carrying a wave of hope through the room. Aisha spoke next, her calm demeanor a powerful counterbalance to Marcus's fiery passion. "This isn't just about us," she said. "It's about the next family, the next traveler, who deserves to feel safe and respected, no matter what they look like." As the event continued, attendees shared their own experiences, many of them echoing Marcus and Aisha's story. By the end of the night, they had a growing list of volunteers and allies ready to take the fight to the next level. The airline response. Again, the pressure mounted on the airline. Public outcry, coupled with the growing movement Marcus and Aisha had sparked, forced their hand. A week after the town hall, the airline CEO, Janet Myers, requested a meeting. The invitation came with an offer to participate in a roundtable discussion about systemic change in the industry. The meeting took place in a sleek corporate boardroom, where Marcus, Aisha, and Dana sat across from Myers and her team of executives. Captain Harris was also present, his quiet but commanding presence a reminder of the incident that had brought them all there. "We want to apologize again for what happened," Myers began, her tone polished but careful. "And we're committed to doing better. That's why we're here, to listen and to work together on solutions." Aisha leaned forward, her gaze unwavering. "Listening is a good start," she said, "but we need more than promises. We need action." Dana laid out a series of demands, including mandatory bias training for all airline employees, a transparent process for reporting and addressing discrimination, and a public commitment to diversity in hiring and leadership. Myers hesitated but ultimately agreed to most of the demands, acknowledging the airline's role in perpetuating systemic issues. The meeting ended with cautious optimism, but Marcus and Aisha knew the real work was just beginning. Building the framework for change. Over the next few months, Marcus and Aisha worked tirelessly with Dana and their growing network of allies. They launched an advocacy campaign, Clear Skies Initiative, aimed at holding airlines accountable and pushing for industry-wide reform. The campaign garnered national attention, attracting endorsements from prominent figures and organizations. Social media became their most powerful tool. Aisha, with her knack for storytelling, curated posts that combined personal narratives with hard-hitting statistics. Marcus, ever the strategist, worked behind the scenes to secure funding and partnerships. The initiative's momentum culminated in a Senate hearing, where Marcus and Aisha testified before lawmakers about their experience and the need for legislative action. Their testimony was raw and compelling, leaving an indelible impression on the room. Monica's reckoning. In the midst of their advocacy work, Monica's fate was revealed. The airline announced her termination, citing her actions as a violation of their policies. While the news brought a sense of closure, Marcus and Aisha didn't dwell on it. Their focus was on the broader fight, the one that extended far beyond a single flight or a single person. "She was just a symptom," Aisha said one evening as they reviewed their latest campaign updates. "The system is what we're trying to fix." Marcus nodded, his resolve unwavering. "And we're not stopping until it's done." A legacy in motion. As the Clear Skies Initiative gained traction, Marcus and Aisha's lives changed in ways they hadn't anticipated. They became sought-after speakers, traveling the country to share their story and inspire others to stand up against injustice. Their work led to the introduction of the Fair Skies Act, a landmark bill aimed at addressing discrimination in the airline industry. One evening, As they walked hand in hand through their neighborhood, Marcus glanced at Aisha, a soft smile on his face. "Did you ever think we'd end up here?" Aisha chuckled. "Not in a million years. But I wouldn't change it. This is where we're meant to be." They stopped at a bench overlooking the city skyline, the lights twinkling like stars against the dark expanse. For the first time in months, they allowed themselves a moment of stillness, a chance to reflect on how far they had come. "We've made a dent," Marcus said, his voice filled with quiet pride. Aisha nodded, resting her head on his shoulder. "And we're just getting started." Together, they watched the city below, knowing their fight was far from over, but confident in their ability to keep moving forward. They had turned a moment of injustice into a movement of hope. And for them, that was just the beginning. A movement solidifies. Months turned into a year, and the Clear Skies initiative grew beyond anything Marcus and Aisha could have imagined. What had begun as a response to personal injustice evolved into a national reckoning. Airlines across the country, wary of public backlash, began implementing changes inspired by the initiative. Some even partnered directly with Marcus and Aisha, seeking their guidance to rebuild trust with marginalized communities. The Fair Skies Act gained traction in Congress, thanks in part to Dana Caldwell's legal expertise and Marcus and Aisha's relentless advocacy. They attended hearings, organized rallies, and worked tirelessly behind the scenes to ensure the bill didn't lose momentum. Their efforts were supported by a growing coalition of allies, activists, legislators, and everyday citizens who believed in the movement's mission. The airline's public commitment. Janet Myers, the airline CEO, invited Marcus and Aisha to attend a press conference where the company would unveil its new policies. It was a calculated move, an opportunity for the airline to show they were taking accountability seriously. Marcus and Aisha agreed, but only on the condition that they would have a platform to speak freely. The event was held in a grand conference hall, packed with reporters and cameras. Myers stood at the podium, outlining the airline's reforms: mandatory bias training for all employees, a streamlined reporting system for passengers experiencing discrimination, and a diversity council to oversee hiring and promotion practices. When Myers finished, she introduced Marcus and Aisha, who stepped up to the podium together. Marcus spoke first, his voice strong but measured. "These changes are a step in the right direction," he said. "But let me be clear, this is not the end. Accountability isn't a one-time act. It's an ongoing process. We'll continue to watch, and we'll continue to speak out until this industry reflects the values it claims to uphold." Aisha followed, her tone calm yet commanding. "This isn't just about airplanes or policies. It's about dignity. It's about ensuring that no one ever feels out of place in a space they have every right to occupy. This isn't just our fight, it's everyone's." The room erupted in applause, the sound echoing like a promise. As Marcus and Aisha stepped away from the podium, they exchanged a glance, a shared acknowledgement of how far they had come. A personal victory. Back home, the weight of their journey began to lift. Marcus and Aisha allowed themselves a rare evening of rest, sitting together on their balcony as the city hummed quietly below. The horizon was tinged with the orange glow of sunset, a soft reminder of the resilience they had built together. "Do you think we've done enough?" Marcus asked, his voice thoughtful. Aisha leaned her head against his shoulder. "We've done what we could," she said, "and we've inspired others to do the same. That's more than enough." Marcus smiled, wrapping an arm around her. "You know, I never imagined we'd be here, lobbying Congress, leading a movement. It's a long way from where we started." Aisha chuckled softly. "Life has a funny way of putting us where we need to be." They sat in silence for a while, the cool evening breeze carrying away the echoes of their past struggles. For the first time in a long while, Marcus felt a sense of peace, not because the fight was over, but because they had turned their pain into progress. Monica's reflection. Meanwhile, Monica sat in her modest apartment, the events of the past year playing on a loop in her mind. She had spent months reflecting on her actions, attending counseling sessions as part of the airline's mandatory remediation program. She had resisted at first, but as time passed, she began to confront the biases that had shaped her worldview. The public backlash against her actions had been harsh, and rightly so. But it was the quiet moments, reading letters from passengers who shared their experiences, listening to the testimonies of people like Marcus and Aisha, that forced her to reckon with the harm she had caused. One evening, she sat at her desk and began to write. The letter was addressed to Marcus and Aisha. She knew she might never send it, but the words poured out nonetheless. "I owe you an apology," she wrote, "not just for what I did, but for what it represents. I see now that my actions were rooted in assumptions I never questioned, and for that, I am deeply sorry. Your courage has changed more than you know. It has changed me." As Monica finished the letter, a small sense of hope stirred within her, a hope that she could be better, even if it came too late to undo the past. A legacy of change. Months later, the Fair Skies Act passed with bipartisan support, marking a historic moment for the airline industry. The law mandated industry-wide reforms, including bias training, transparent reporting systems, and independent oversight committees. Marcus and Aisha were invited to the signing ceremony, where they stood alongside legislators, activists, and Captain Harris, who had become one of their most vocal allies. As the ceremony concluded, Marcus turned to Aisha, his voice filled with quiet pride. "We did it." Aisha smiled, her eyes shining with emotion. "No," she said, "we all did." The final flight. A year later, Marcus and Aisha boarded another first-class flight, this time for a well-earned vacation. As they settled into their seats, the flight attendant approached with a warm smile. "Mr. and Mrs. Johnson," she said, handing them a note. "This is from the captain." Marcus unfolded the paper, reading the brief message aloud. "Thank you for helping us fly higher, Captain Harris." They exchanged a look, their hearts swelling with gratitude. For the first time in a long while, they felt like they truly belonged, not just in their seats, but in the world. As the plane soared into the sky, Marcus and Aisha leaned back, their hands intertwined. The turbulence of the past was behind them, and the horizon stretched wide and clear, filled with endless possibilities. They weren't just passengers on a plane. They were trailblazers in a movement that had taken flight, and they knew their journey was far from over.